when we look at Winston Churchill, who, as you have mentioned, was completely demonized in this interview, seen as the chief villain of World War II, what is Winston Churchill's actual role in World War II? Was he truly, as people think he was, and I believe he was, the indispensable man of World War II? If Winston Churchill had never existed, how does the war go differently?
Well, I think A.J.P. Taylor, who was no conservative, was right when he described Churchill in a footnote in his English history as the savior of his nation. But I actually went further in a book called Empire, written more than 20 years ago, arguing that Churchill was really the savior of the West, maybe even the savior of the world, because at the darkest moments of British history, which was in 1940 when the British Expeditionary Force had been evacuated from Dunkirk, with entirely losing its equipment and also losing many men, it returned demoralized to Britain, and Britain faced the prospect of invasion and certainly the prospect of air attacks from Germany. There were many conservatives who were ready to consider some kind of settlement with Hitler. It wasn't as if there was unanimity that Britain should fight on. But Churchill, having consistently argued in the 1930s that Hitler posed a mortal threat, that Britain must rearm, arguments for which he was reviled at the time, had by 1940 won the legitimacy that led him to be prime minister. And Churchill inspired British people to fight on, even when the odds seemed daunting. And remember, this was at a time when Britain was alone. France had collapsed. Hitler controlled all of Western Europe. The United States was not in the war. And Britain also had to reckon with attacks by Italy and Japan, the other members of the Axis. So it's clear that Churchill was the vital factor, the indispensable man who rallied British morale and persuaded the British that they could fight on, if necessarily, alone. Anybody who's not listened to Churchill's wartime speeches, which are some of the most brilliant speeches ever given, and also some of the most powerful prose ever written, has missed out, because I think they're an indispensable part of an education. I used to play them to my children on an old audio cassette when I drove them to school. You can't understand Churchill's importance until you realize the power of those words. And my grandparents often used to refer to the influence and inspiration that Churchill gave, even though my grandfather was no conservative. In fact, he was hostile to Churchill's domestic politics. But I think that's the thing that people miss. And they miss that if Churchill had not been there and another leader, say Lord Halifax, had negotiated terms with Hitler, that would not have been the end of it. That would just have given the Germans the opportunity to prepare for the next phase of Hitler's plan for world domination.
One of the claims that is constantly made about Churchill is the suggestion by revisionists that, for example, the reason that Churchill did not sign some sort of separate peace was a pathetic attempt to maintain the British Empire, which, of course, I think ignores the actual terms that Germany would have imposed on Britain. If they were similar to what were imposed on France, then that would have meant, presumably, the dismantling or seizure of the British Navy, which would have meant a complete shift in world power. At the very least, it would have meant that the British would have to go neutral in the war in the Atlantic. It would have meant, presumably, access to oil resources in the Middle East that were controlled by the British and that Rommel attempted to gain in the middle of the war. And the follow-up effects of a peace between Germany and England would have meant German world domination, essentially.
And you can see why, therefore, those terms were rejected if you read the relevant parts of War of the World, which was my attempt to address these issues. War of the World shows why the policy of appeasement was adopted by Churchill's predecessors, Stanley Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain, and why it failed. Not because of naivety, but because I think of a miscalculation about what would happen if you just played for time. Appeasement was about playing for time to rearm. The problem was that Hitler got the time too, and he made better use of it. When the moment of truth came and the idea of some kind of separate peace or some kind of compromise with Hitler was discussed, it wasn't too hard for Churchill to win the argument, since it was so obvious to the other members of the cabinet that the peace was a phony peace that would have subjugated Britain and opened the door for German world domination. So I don't think anybody should take those peace offers at face value, especially as we have documentary evidence of what Hitler really thought. You see, the problem for Darrell Cooper, who's never done, as far as I can see, the necessary reading, is that he's unaware that even as Hitler was making peace offers, he was describing Britain as our hate-inspired antagonist, our eternal enemy, to the fellow members of the Nazi government in Berlin. So Hitler's on the record as not being sincere in these peace offers.
Are you tired of the lies and the twist of the mainstream media talking points? Yeah, me too. Join me in my newest series, Fact, where I dismantle and bring truth to this tiring mainstream agenda.